Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Martine, and if you are new here, I do videos on Vedic astrology mainly, but also with some tropical insights, and I focus on both relationship and natal astrology. And if you like this video and you would like to see more content from me, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, I do consultations on a wide variety of topics. Please check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. Thank you. Today's video is going to be about a topic that has been requested, and it's also something that I have also considered talking about for some time now, and namely it is about Ketu-dominant people. Ketu-dominant people. It's about archetypes connected to Ketu. It's about understanding the Ketu energy. I'm going to be getting into a lot of examples about how examples on how Ketu manifested in various people's lives, the way that it shows in arts, what it stands for, how you can easily spot the Ketu energy in a person's life, and the things that they care about and the way they manifest themselves, just so you can better understand these kinds of people, and well, hopefully it will give you a richer perspective of reality. This is the way that I see it. And before I get into the rest of the video, the topic at hand, I want to get into how exactly you can spot that you are a Ketu dominant person. That is really quite the question. Well, as usual, basically, the more conjunctions involving Ketu you have in your natal chart, the more Ketu dominant you are. And especially in the Navamsha, if you have Ketu in one of the Trikona houses, the 5th, the 9th, I think, yeah, and the 1st, I think, houses, then you are very Ketu dominant, and you are a very spiritual, and you are said to be a person who can see through the Maya, or the world of material illusion, as it is described by Rahu. Because remember that Ketu is the opposite of Rahu. Rahu is the material world, Ketu is the spirit world. And, well, I will ask you to forget about any of the things that you would normally consider to be true when you are watching this video, because basically in order to really understand Ketu energy, you have to accept the fact that there are things out there that we cannot really map through our human minds. And there are things like entities, things like whatever you want to call them, and different people have called them different things throughout the ages. You can call them spirits. There are spirits of the people who have lived before, demons, angels, whatever you want to call it. So basically, everything that falls into the unseen world, things like the Akashic records, things like that, all of this stuff is ruled by Ketu. Spirits, ghosts, whatever, so on and so forth. So if you are a person who has Ketu in the 1st house, Ketu in one of the water houses, the 4th, the 8th, the 12th house, you are a very strong Ketu energy person. If you have Ketu conjunct the moon, especially the moon, because the moon is the mind and it is the most sensitive, intuitive part of a person's personality. So if you have Ketu conjunct the moon, or if you have the moon in one of the Ketu ruled nakshatras, which are Ashwini, Magha, or Mula, and let me tell you how they span. So Magha spans from 0 to 13 degrees and 20 minutes Leo in the sidereal zodiac. Ashwini spans from 0 degrees to 13 degrees 20 minutes Aries in sidereal, and Mula spans from 0 degrees to 13 degrees and 20 minutes Sagittarius in sidereal zodiac. As you know, I use the sidereal zodiac. And one of the things that I will say about this, as you can see, that the Ketu ruled nakshatras start in a fire sign. They actually start the fire signs. And this is because fire as an energy basically represents spirituality. It represents the human spirit and human drive. So, well, you know, if you want to go back to that legend that whatever Prometheus gave mankind fire and he was cast away and stuff like that. It really spans from that. So this is the divine spark of creation. This is spirituality, basically. And people who are very Ketu-dominant are very spiritual. Now, what does spiritual mean? So Rahu is, think about it as a contrasting Rahu. So Rahu is a person who's Rahu dominant is going to be very much into this world, right? They're going to be following trends. They're going to be following Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. People who are very Ketu dominant, they might not even know what these things are. Like, I'm not even exaggerating. Even in the 21st century, they could be people who want to live in isolation. They are people who couldn't care less about social status, unless they are really looking for something else, and social status is kind of like a means to an end rather than the end in itself. So for instance, a person could want more freedom, and they know that money will give them freedom, so they will go for money, or they will go for a career that makes them money. But they're not after the status, they're not after the power, they're only after the financial freedom. And actually what they want is to have more free time so they could focus on their inner world, their very rich inner world and creativity. Because as you're going to see from the examples, Ketu dominant people are usually extremely creative, and when they are not creating, actually there's something kind of like depressed about them. But I digress. So this is one way to see that if you are Ketu dominant. So if you have Ketu in the first house, if you have Ketu conjunct the moon, conjunct any of the other planets, basically, or aspected, you know, if the other planets are aspected by Ketu, by the 5th and 9th aspect of Ketu, because remember I said Ketu and Rahu cast aspects to the 1st, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th placements from where they stand in the natal chart or in any chart. But the 7th aspect doesn't count because that's where Rahu sits. So any planet that is in the 7th house from Ketu will be conjunct Rahu, and Rahu will take over that sphere of influence. So that planet will cross over into Rahu's sphere of materialism. But if a planet is conjunct Ketu, it will stay into spirituality. Again, if you have a lot of planets in the nakshatras of Ketu, especially the moon, the sun, or the ascendant, especially if you have several or all of these three, you're going to be a very Ketu dominant person. Also, like I mentioned, so if you have Ketu in the 1st, the 5th, or the 9th house in the Navamsha, you're a very spiritual person. Now, another thing that I will mention about Ketu is that Ketu is not, so you have to make a distinction between spirituality and religion. Actually, most likely, people who are very Ketu dominant don't like religion. They don't care about religion. Because religion oftentimes has nothing to do with spirituality. This is a really long debate in itself, but very briefly, basically, religion caters to people's basic needs, actually. If you actually break down any religion on the planet, even though they have spiritual practices that go along with the religions, they always have some material benefits that come out of it, right? People go into organized religion because they get a sense of belonging, they get a sense of community, they want to hang out with people who have the same values, etc. They get support, etc., etc. So there's always some kind of a material benefit that you get from an organized religion. This is why Ketu dominant people don't care about religion. They care about literally knowing the big plan. Actually, one of the descriptions that I have come across is that literally people who have Ketu, for instance, in the 1st, the 5th, or the 9th of the Navamsha, they can see through the Maya. They can I don't mean like they see spirits, but they have a very strong intuition. They can perceive universal truths that most people cannot see, because most people who are living in the material world are blinded by the, quote, illusions of the material world. The bling bling and the, whatever, the pleasures of the material world. But people who are very Ketu, another thing that you're going to see is that they really will shy away from any kind of material things. Like, they're not going to care about status, and I mentioned this before, so they're not going to care about status. The funny thing is that even the people who are very successful, who have a lot of Ketu energy, you're going to see them like, you know, they might have a cracked phone, or like they'll wear the same jeans and t-shirts all over the place in public. You're generally going to see them just not giving a shit. Like, they're not going to care about wearing designer clothing. They're going to wear what they feel like, what they find comfortable. And, you know, like, I'm going to get into the examples. You're going to see more of that. So another thing that I wanted to say, let me check the notes before I digress. So the Ketu energy in general stands for, like I said, everything that has to do with spirituality. So it rules things like death. It rules the transformation, the spiritual world. Ketu actually in Vedic astrology is kind of seen as similar to Mars in energy, which is really interesting because you would not think of Ketu as a Mars energy, but it is. So Mars is the warrior spirit, right? It is about fighting, it's about survival, it's all this stuff. So Ketu is basically like a tired old Mars, you know, like a person who has fought for many reincarnations, and now they're just like, they're tired of fighting, you know, like they don't care about this stuff. They don't care about the material world. They don't care about winning the war because they know it's all shit. You know that, and even to the extreme, Ketu people don't even care about what they look like. They don't care about their health. They can neglect themselves a lot because they have this mentality of like, what's the point? I'm gonna die anyway, you know? And even though some of them might not even be aware of this kind of thinking, they somewhere in the back of their heads, they will have this kind of thinking of like, you know, this is all temporary. We're all gonna die at some point, so what's the point? Why should I hit the gym for 2 hours a day, for instance? Why should I stop smoking? Why should I don't know, why should I care about football? Like, for example, etc., etc., so on and so forth. So actually, really, to sum it up, and I think I have used this quote before, there's this great quote by Albert Einstein that said, I only want to know how God thinks, or something. I only want to know God's thoughts. Everything else is detail. And actually, he was a very Ketu-dominant person, as you would expect. Like, Einstein is a very good example, really, because he was someone that, and this is another thing. Wait, I am getting ahead of myself. But basically, that's in a nutshell. You know, they will have this kind of personality that, because of the fact that from the time that they're very young, they are very spiritual. People think they're weird. And another thing that you're often going to see in the lives of people who are very Ketu-dominant is that sometimes their lives come hand in hand with suffering. And this is really interesting because it's a question of what came first, the chicken or the egg, you know, like, is the Ketu causing the suffering, or is the suffering causing the spirituality, or are spiritual people just more prone to suffering? That's really the question. But if we are to believe in reincarnation, which we have to believe if we really follow astrology, the soul chooses a life, even though it knows what it's going to experience in the material plane. So the theory is that people who are very Ketu-dominant, they choose a path that will lead them to spirituality. So oftentimes they will go through suffering in life, a lot of suffering, you know, depending on what the Ketu is placed in. Like, for instance, I'm not exactly sure, but I think in one of the divisional charts, I forgot which divisional chart, but I can look for it later if you're interested. If you have Ketu in the 12th house, it basically means that you have come in this life to achieve total liberation, which is moksha, which means that you want to give away all material desires. Because the theory is that if a person dies and at the moment of death they have unfulfilled desires, they will keep reincarnating. Okay, this is something that is talked about in Vedic astrology, but it's also talked about in other cultures, as far as I have heard, in other religions, etc., etc. So that's something to keep in mind, you know, because Ketu people are basically working on letting go. If you have a person, another prominent placement, the way that you know that your path is connected to spirituality, which very few people actually have this kind of a spiritual path, is you could have like Atmakarka conjunct Ketu or Amatyakarka conjunct Ketu. Again, Ketu prominently placed in the Navamsha, because the Navamsha is basically a expanded version of the ninth house, which the ninth house in itself stands for your religious beliefs, your spirituality, the way you see the big picture, your view of the world at large, blah blah blah, your faith, etc. So people who have strong Ketu, they're all about spirituality. That's the bottom line. And another thing that you're going to see is that Ketu people, so again, I started from the idea of, I don't know which came first, the suffering or the spirituality, but they probably go hand in hand, like I said. So it's probably that the soul chooses suffering to achieve spirituality. And because of this, and it's really funny because it goes hand in hand with psychology when you think about it. In psychology, for instance, if let's say a child grows up in an abusive environment, they will automatically, by virtue of the way that they're growing up, they will feel separate from the rest of their peers. Because think about it this way, right? Most kids, let's say, they go through an average upbringing, and there's one kid who has like abusive parents, goes through maybe horrible forms of abuse. Think about, I don't know, ritualistic abuse or sexual abuse or blah blah blah. And that child really lives in a totally different reality than the rest of the kids that he goes to school with or she goes to school with. So automatically, by virtue of these experiences, they will feel like an outsider. They will feel like they don't really belong. And this in itself triggers an entire host of things. Like, it probably triggers like lifelong quests for answers. Like, why did this happen to me? What is the meaning of it all? What is the point of suffering? You know, whereas let's say a person who is raised who grows up and starts out in life having everything handed out to them. Like, let's say you were born into a wealthy family and you just have everything you ever wanted. You never have to feel fear or anything unpleasant, not for any extensive period of time anyway. You don't have any real stress or worries. Then you're probably not going to be asking yourself, what is the meaning of life? I don't know. Or maybe you will at some point when you get bored in between snorting cocaine and getting drunk. You're probably going to be asking yourself, what is the point? Where's God? And all this stuff. But most likely, no. Most of these people who end up in, who are raised in material abundance, actually, most of them, they end up self-destructing in some way or another because they become entangled in the Maya. They keep chasing the next big thing, the next shiny object, etc., etc. But I digress again. So oftentimes, because of these Ketu-dominant people experience suffering, they automatically grow up feeling different. And guess what? People treat them like they're different. You're also, by the way, especially going to see this if you have Ketu in the Aruda Lagna, or if you have Ketu in the third from the Aruda Lagna, people will see you as weird. And you might feel like you are being shunned a lot growing up, and even later on in life. But basically, because of this feeling, so there is a theme, actually, that's what I'm trying to say. There is a theme connected to Ketu and feeling like an outsider, feeling like you're less than, like you don't belong. Like, there's a feeling of not belonging to the rest of the peers or the group that you come from. So if you are a Ketu-dominant person, chances are that you probably felt this. Also, Ketu will give you a very unique perspective on life because you are not really fully in the Maya. Of course, there are degrees of spirituality, and if you also have other placements that show spirituality, this could go to the point of like people becoming psychic, seeing other dimensions, seeing spirits, going really nuts. It could actually lead to that, okay? But otherwise, if you're just like, you're not seeing different things and you're not like on a different dimension, etc., you are at the very least a hypersensitive person. So you're the kind of person that will easily pick up on subtle things that nobody else notices. Like, you have a really great intuition, of course, depending also on the aspects, on when it sits, on the house placements, the sign placements, the nakshatras, the blah blah blah, all of that stuff. Of course, there will be slight variations, but overall, people with strong Ketu energy, they will tend to have a very strong intuition, and you need to, if you are a Ketu dominant person, you need to trust that intuition. Chances are, more likely than not, especially for those of you who have like strong Ketu in the Navamsha, your intuitions are almost always right. Because they're almost always right, because literally, I mean, this is what the sages said. If you have Ketu in the 1st, the 5th, or the 9th of the Navamsha, you can see through the Maya. So you can see universal truth that nobody else can see. Another thing is, people being Ketu dominant spiritual, and because they don't care about things, they will always go for things like, you know, anti-racism, anti-sexism. They will always go for people seeing each other as a spiritual entity. So they will always fight for this desire to get other people to recognize that we are spiritual beings. So you're not going to see a racist Ketu dominant person. You're not going to see you know, a sexist Ketu dominant person. Some Ketu dominant people, or I would say most of them, reach a point where they almost become Buddhist. Like, you know, they don't want to harm any living being. Some of them become vegan, etc. Now, of course, there are also variations when it comes to this. There might be differences, but basically, the more Ketu dominant you are, the more spiritual, the more empathetic you become. So that's the bottom line. And another thing that I wanted to say, so like I said, so basically Ketu, the only sign that it co-rules is the sign of Scorpio. And Scorpio is also connected to the meaning of Ketu and all the things that Ketu stands for. Because when you think about it, Scorpio is the sign of death, is the sign of transformation in general, because death is transformation, basically. At least, again, according to the Vedic principles. Death is a form of, basically, you're switching from one state to another, and it rules fear. It rules, like, Scorpio rules fears. And this is actually something that only occurred to me relatively recently, that Scorpio people, the reason why Scorpio is the sign that is most connected to things like detective work, investigation, risk-taking behavior, but especially things like, you know, digging to the point, like digging to the end of the earth. Like, they will keep digging for the truth, for answers, for you know, they will leave no stone unturned, all that. And the reason for this, when you think about it, is because Scorpio dominant people, they really think that if they get enough answers, they can eliminate fear. Right? I mean, that's the whole point of this. Is basically, when we have all the answers, we're not going to fear anything. That is really the human motivation behind constant investigations and all this stuff. So that's the way, at least, that I see it. This is why Ketu is connected to fears and spirituality and all this stuff. This is why Scorpio rules fears and investigations at the same time. And Ketu really is connected to death. It's connected to things like I mentioned, spiritual, so things that are beyond death. But it's also just connected to death in itself. And you're going to see, again, more when I get to the examples, that it really shows up in people's psyches and imagery and taste in art and all this stuff, the way that it is connected to all this, like, spiritual stuff. Okay. So, okay, this is pretty much what I wanted to say about Ketu in general. Another thing that I will say before I get to... Okay, actually, no. I'm going to start with the examples, but I'm going to mention that when it comes to physical appearance, I've noticed, again, and I apologize for this because I've really tried to look for examples, like, for instance, African American people or people of different races, but I haven't found anyone that actually has, like, Ketu in the first house or a strong Ketu energy. I don't know, like, many of them do not have the, like, time of birth known, etc., etc. So, yeah. Like, I haven't really managed to find almost any examples of a different race, because I really would have been curious to see how Ketu influences physical appearance. Because when it comes to people of the Caucasian backgrounds, what I have noticed almost all the time with Ketu, if not all the time, is that it makes a person very pale. And again, this is like, I'm gonna make a kind of a long parenthesis again. The reason why Ketu is connected to white as a color, or rather as a non-color, is because, again, it is connected to spirituality. When you think about it, for instance, a lot of Eastern cultures, they wrap up the dead in white cloths, basically. And in the Western society, the bride wears white because it's seen as a purity thing, quote unquote. But why is it seen as a purity thing? It's basically, white is the absence of any organic material. So when you think about ghosts, the way that people have portrayed ghosts throughout the centuries, they have always portrayed them as white, or kind of a pasty something, like translucent things. This is because there is no organic matter in something that is a spirit. And in my humble opinion, now I might be off, but this is why people who have a lot of Ketu energy seem to have extremely pale skin. At least as far as I know. Another thing, as far as I've seen, another thing that I have noticed also, so when it comes to physical appearance, you want to look for the ascendant being in a Ketu-ruled nakshatra. But first and foremost, the most powerful influence is Ketu in the first house. Another aspect of having Ketu influence on the ascendant is having Ketu conjunct the ascendant lord, or at the very least aspecting the ascendant lord. To some extent, that's also true. But of course, when it comes to the ascendant and the ascendant lord, you also have to look at other planetary influences, because there could be other things that overpower this influence. Just to give you some examples, like of people that I've seen who are extremely pale, are Nicole Kidman, Marina Diamandis, and Bryan Cranston, who played Heisenberg in Breaking Bad, and Dakota Fanning has ascendant in Ashwini, which is a Ketu-dominant nakshatra. Nikola Tesla had ascended in Ashwini, in Aries, because Ashwini is in Aries, and so the ascendant lord Mars is conjunct Ketu. He was also very pale. There are a bunch of examples. Bryce Dallas Howard has ruler of the ascendant Jupiter conjunct Saturn in the 7th house, and is aspected by Ketu's 9th aspect. She's also very pale. And there are a bunch of examples, like there are tons of them, I think. Steve Jobs also had a decent Ketu influence. But let me get, so this is as far as physical appearances. Another thing that I've seen with regards to physical appearance, and also wait, before I move on, Stephen King. Stephen King has, I think he has ascendant in Gemini. Or no, Cancer. He has ascendant in Cancer. Yes, he has ascendant in Cancer, and Moon is conjunct Ketu. and very strong Ketu influence, but I'm gonna get to him at the end. But another thing that I've noticed with regards to physical appearance is Ketu, much like Rahu, gives a rather strange physical appearance. The typical description, actually, the traditional descriptions that I have come across, oftentimes associated Ketu in the first house with a frail physical body and rather sickly constitution, but I don't necessarily think that that's true. First of all, even in the text, for instance, it says that if the Lagna Lord aspects the ascendant, this is cancelled, so you can expect a person to be rather robust if they have the Lagna Lord aspecting the ascendant. But aside from that, it tends to give a person a rather strange appearance. So exactly how strange, it would be difficult to explain, actually. I've seen Ketu giving oftentimes slanted eyes that seem really dreamy and stuff, and they also seem to have an appearance that makes them look really wise, like spiritual, maybe wise beyond their years. But in the worst case scenario, it can make a person look kind of bland. Like it can make, like people who could easily blend in with the crowd, and they seem kind of like, small and unassuming. Because again, Ketu is opposite from Rahu, so you would expect a person with Rahu in the first house to be out there and front and center and standing out in a crowd, because all eyes on me kind of thing. But Ketu in the ascendant would be the opposite of that. It's someone who doesn't even care about what they look like. They want to blend in almost. But whether they manage to blend in or not, it depends on the rest of the chart. But one of the things that I have heard, and I do think is true, is, funny enough, I wouldn't necessarily call Ketu a feminine energy. And especially Ketu in the first house actually shows that throughout previous reincarnations, you have really mastered the art of being alone. So, and Ketu is, like I have said, connected to Mars energy. So it's basically kind of like a spiritual, a higher octave of Mars. It's kind of like the wise warrior, the silent warrior. But it still retains that basic harshness that Mars has. This is also why Ketu is still seen as a malefic. Despite the fact that Ketu rules spirituality, it is still seen as a malefic. And I'm not going to give you the legend of the dragon and stuff. I do suggest that if you want to hear that legend, you check out the video that I made about Rahu and Ketu and how to read them in the natal chart. But basically, another thing is that Ketu rules instinct as well. So it doesn't just rule intuition. On the elevated side, it does rule intuition, but on a lower level, it can make a person really impulsive, much like Mars, because there's almost like a connection to blindness when it comes to, because again, it goes back to the legend, right? Ketu is the half of the dragon that has lost its head, but is condemned to immortality, and now doesn't have a head to guide it and doesn't have eyes to see, so it's floating into outer space, basically blind. Okay, I've given you the short of the legend. So this is basically the legend, but yeah, so Ketu is also ruled to instinctive behavior, and it also, like I've seen, it gives kind of slanted eyes and a really kind of unusual physical appearance, I guess, but not too unusual. Let me think, what else was I gonna say? And it also, another thing that I've seen, it gives a person, especially for women, it gives them a kind of almost ethereal kind of energy, but not always. Again, it depends on other aspects, but it can give a woman a really, the funny thing about it, and that's kind of what I started to say, is that Ketu in the ascendant, especially, or aspecting the ascendant, or the ascendant Lagna, the Lagna Lord, tends to make a woman appear feminine, but this is not really actually feminine. It kind of gives a false femininity, if you will. Why? Because Ketu really just makes people not care. So it gives this kind of an ego-less energy about a person. And when it comes to women, men oftentimes, and I've seen this a lot, seem to mistake this like lack of ego and lack of materialism for femininity, when in reality it has nothing to do with it. and oftentimes men can feel deceived by these women because they can come across as, you know, very ethereal and cute and nice and even friendly, or like can be interpreted as friendly or just easy-go-lucky. But the reality is that, number one, they probably don't care. And number two is that they're actually very spiritually oriented. And let's not forget that Mars in the first house actually makes a person fiercely independent. These are people who have spent many reincarnations slaying dragons by themselves. This is how you have to think of them. So no matter what they look like on the surface, they can actually be people that they can be forces to be reckoned with, you know, funny enough, much like the character that Bryan Cranston portrays in Breaking Bad. You know, he is this really underrated, overlooked chemistry teacher who basically becomes a drug lord. And, you know, this is kind of like the potential of Ketu, because Ketu still has that in them. You know, they have that fighting spirit, they have that independence, that impulsiveness, but they don't use it unless they absolutely have to. And like I was saying, when it comes to women, I've seen this a lot of times, that men see them as this cute little creature, and then they turn out to be, when they realize how independent these women actually are, they start to feel deceived, or they start to feel that they were manipulated or whatever, or there's something weird about them. But this is because oftentimes, especially since we live right now in a very materialistic world, we are living in the age of Aquarius, which, is co-ruled by Rahu. By the way, I was planning on making an entire separate video on the age of Aquarius. As a parenthesis, please comment if you want to see that. But basically, we live in this hyper-materialistic world where, you know, you see people like the Kardashians, and you see women who have getting fillers in everywhere except their eyelids, and when you see a woman who's Ketu-dominant, she comes across as this really simple kind of country girl, you know, at first sight. But again, this is because she doesn't care. You know, she's not on Instagram because she doesn't care. She's probably reading philosophy and, I don't know, conjuring stuff and getting into tarot or reading God knows what that you would probably be afraid to find out about. But on the surface, you will not see that. You're just going to see this really unassuming, delicate little creature. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. When it comes to the men, actually, funny enough, Ketu in the first house makes a person insecure. Actually, falsely, the typical descriptions will say that Ketu in the first house makes a person very shy and insecure. Yes and no. This person is insecure when it comes to relationships. Because remember, Rahu shows that what you don't know. So, Rahu in the 7th house shows that these people have like almost no experience in relationships. So they don't know how to handle people. But when it comes to themselves, they know very well who they are, and they know how to handle their business. So they might come across as awkward, as weird in social situations, but do not be fooled, and don't think for a second that these people are easy to manipulate, or that they are, you know, stupid and meek and any of this stuff. Again, if you are tempted to think this about a Ketu-dominant person, always remember the character of Heisenberg. You know, say my name, that kind of thing. Like, these people are always, they have that potential. They have that potential to rule an entire, you know, empire of, an underground empire of drugs. But they don't care about this shit. That's why they don't care, you know. Actually, funny enough, in Breaking Bad, the catalyst for what's his name, Walter White, was the fact that he was sick and he was dying, right? the Ketu thing was the Ketu. He was facing, his own death, and he was like, F it, I'm gonna do whatever I feel like because I'm on my deathbed. Anyway, I digress. So, examples that I wanted to talk about. So, I did mention some of the examples when it comes to physical appearance. Slanted eyes, delicate features, a little bit strange sometimes features, and definitely, as far as Caucasians are concerned, very pale. When it comes to people of color, I really have no idea. Like, my intuition would be that at least when it comes to black people, I would expect that they would look not necessarily more pale, but rather that they would have a cool skin tone. So, for instance, Lupita Nyong'o, I would almost bet that she has a very strong Ketu influence, but unfortunately her time of birth is not known, so I don't know where her ascendant is. But my impression is that she is very likely either Ketu in the first, or like she has some strong Ketu influence. I could be off, but that's the feeling that I get based on her appearance and her energy. But yeah, if you know of any people of different races who have Ketu in the first house, please comment in the comment section because I'm really curious. Anyway, this was with regards to physical appearance. And now when it comes to personality, it's really interesting. So first of all, another thing that I should have mentioned, I did kind of like in a roundabout way mentioned, is that placements in Scorpio also count as strong Ketu influence. Because now normally it's not like any planet in Scorpio is going to be a strong Ketu, because Scorpio and Ketu are not identical energies. Scorpio also has some Mars going on, and depending on the nakshatra, they are ruled by different planets. But Scorpio in itself is a sign, like I said, it is the only sign that is co-ruled by Ketu. So if you see a lot of planets in Scorpio, you are likely going to see some Ketu energy there. And I just wanted to say this before I get into the examples. So it is really funny to me. I've come across so many examples of people who I think embody the Ketu energy very well. Let me give you an example. Guillermo del Toro, a famous director, and just listen to some of the titles that this guy created. Pan's Labyrinth, The Shape of Water, Crimson Peak. These are just some of that I have personally seen. I mean, he's made a lot more than these, I'm pretty sure. But basically, all of the themes in his movie, especially if you've seen Pan's Labyrinth, the themes in his movie are all about otherworldly creatures, almost nightmare-inducing visuals when you look at his films. And it is, which, by the way, this is something that you would see with Ketu. Like, remember Ketu connected to Scorpio and connected to fears? This is something that you would expect. A person who is Ketu dominant, they're gonna love to watch stuff like Poltergeist and I don't know, anything about other dimensions and death and spirits and conjurings and demons and angels. And Constantine, for instance, is a very Ketu-dominated movie. I have looked at Keanu Reeves' chart, and by the way, Keanu Reeves, to me, my instinct tells me that he has Ketu in the first house, but I could be off. Actually, no, according to his official time of birth, I think I was off, but I can't believe, I just cannot get my head around the fact that he doesn't have Ketu in the first house. I don't know, maybe I missed something in his chart, but to me, he comes across as a really Ketu-dominant person. Maybe it shows up in his divisional charts, who knows, I haven't had time to look at them. But yeah, Constantine is definitely something. So any kind of movie that has to deal with fears, with, like ghoulish stuff and like conjurings and stuff like that, this is all Ketu stuff. Okay, it has with things like dreams, like visions, like anything that is otherworldly, basically, is connected to Ketu. And Guillermo del Toro in his movies definitely shows a lot of Ketu-dominated stuff. And guess what? He has Moon in Scorpio in Anuradha Nakshatra, which is ruled by Saturn. Not really relevant. Ketu is aspecting Mars by His time of birth is unknown, by the way. Ketu is aspecting his Mars by 9th aspect. And Venus is in Magha Nakshatra in Leo. Magha Nakshatra is ruled by Ketu. And Venus is the planet that shows your aesthetic sense. It's no wonder to me that his aesthetic sense is basically connected to ghouls and, well, not ghouls, but, you know, otherworldly things, weird visuals, demons, ghosts, creatures of all kinds. I mean, I don't know, if you've seen Pan's Labyrinth, like, there are some pretty nightmare-inducing scenes in that film. Another example of a Ketu-dominant person, like I mentioned, Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein is such a great example of a Ketu-dominant person because the true Ketu person is exactly like this. They don't care about what they look like. He was famous for his disheveled appearance. He didn't care about what he looked like. He didn't care about succeeding in college. He almost failed his exams. And people didn't think that he would add up to much, including his own family, I think. This is so Ketu, you know. People who are very Ketu dominant, they're not motivated by material stuff. They don't care. Like, because again, everything is like, they know that they're gonna die anyway, so it's like, bro, what's the point? You know, what's the point? I'm not gonna stress out, I'm not gonna spend 3 hours in the gym, etc. That's their line of thinking. And in Albert Einstein's case, he had Ketu in Magha, so Ketu was very strong in his chart, because it's in Magha, the nakshatra that it rules, in the 3rd house from the ascendant, which is the house of communication and thinking and efforts, shows what his efforts were directed into and how he used his efforts. So Ketu rules intuition, but it also rules abstract thinking, and he was very good at abstract thinking. So if you want to, for instance, if you want to see a brilliant mathematician or a physicist, you have to have a strong Ketu influence. So, yes, where was I? Ketu is also aspecting his 11th house, and Venus in the 11th house by 9th aspect. And also, he has Ketu in the Lagna of his D10 chart alone, and Ketu in the 9th house in the Navamsha. So this is a person who could see through the Maya, according to the sages. Ketu in the 9th house in the Navamsha. And then Ketu in the Lagna, meaning in the actual ascendant of the D10, which is the house of your social karma, you know, what you have to give to the world. He gave his intuition to the world, which is really beautifully illustrated by his astrology. Another example, and a personal favorite of mine, I can hear the snickers from some people who are going to watch this video, because they know that I've had an obsession with this director for a long time. I'm such a weirdo. And it's M. Night Shyamalan. M. Night Shyamalan, come on. I mean, you may like or hate his movies, but he is the king of Ketu. Okay, The Sixth Sense, hello, I See Dead People. Like, I mean, I See Dead People should be the prayer. I'm sorry, hopefully not, actually. Hopefully not for most Ketu people, but yeah, I See Dead People is definitely a very Ketu dominant affirmation. And unfortunately, his time of birth, just like in Guillermo del Toro's case, is unknown. But he has, even without his time of birth, very strong Ketu energy, because Ketu is conjunct Sun and Mars in his chart. And Ketu and Mars are both in Magha Nakshatra. So Ketu is very strong here. Definitely influenced him and his energy. And he did movies like The Sixth Sense, The Village, The Lady in the Water, The Happening, etc., The Last Airbender. The Last Airbender is probably the only one of his movies that I haven't watched, but I watched, I think, almost all of them, all of the others, and I'm probably one of the few people on Earth who have liked them. Like, I may lose some subscribers on this, but it will be worth it. And the funny enough is that also, yeah, I have mentioned Bryce Dallas Howard. The reason I am mentioning her again is because she was his muse, almost, because she appeared in a few of his films. And she also has Ketu conjunct Mercury in the 11th house, and ruler of the ascendant, Jupiter conjunct Saturn in the 7th house, aspected by Ketu's 9th aspect. So she's also a pretty Ketu dominant person. And she plays an otherworldly being in Lady in the Water. Another great example of the Ketu themes and visuals, Tim Burton. Hello, The Nightmare Before Christmas, The Corpse Bride, Edward Scissorhands. Tim Burton, I mean, hello, he had a movie called The Corpse Bride. The Nightmare Before Christmas, the main character is literally a skeleton. There's so much imagery and themes that have to do with creepy stuff. Everything creepy actually is Ketu, by the way. I should have just used that word. That is the key word, creepy. When you see creepy, you have to immediately think Ketu. And yeah, his visuals, everything is kind of creepy. Edward Scissorhands, the funny enough here, Edward Scissorhands is not just a very creepy movie, but it's also the story of a person who is an outcast. You know, because he has, you know, what, I don't even remember the movie. I have seen it 150 years ago when I was young. But yeah, I've seen it a long time ago, and I don't remember exactly what the story was, but I do know that he was this, like, he had some deformities, or he wasn't even human. Was he a puppet come to life? I don't even remember what the story was, but basically people were afraid of him because he had scissors instead of hands. So there was this theme of isolation about him, and this and he was also, the way he was portrayed, very pale, deathly pale, with a tiny mouth, with big eyes, you know, that were constantly kind of in a state of wonder. So Ketu to me. I mean, at least as, I don't know, as an astrologer, like, I by the way that I found out all of these examples was just like, let me think, which one of the movies, which one of the actors look Ketuvian to me, which one of the movies that I've seen look like Ketu visuals to me, and guess what? Literally all of the ones that I thought had strong Ketu energy have strong Ketu energy. Not to brag, but I have a gift. Basically. So anyway, Tim Burton has Mercury conjunct Sun conjunct Pluto in Magha Nakshatra in his 4th house. Ketu in his 11th house aspecting Saturn by 9th aspect. And Saturn happens to be the ruler, or at least the co-ruler of his 10th house, which sits in Aquarius. So his career is about connected to Ketu-dominant themes. Okay. Nikola Tesla. Have mentioned him also with regards to physical appearance. But for people who are wondering, this guy, you know, he was relatively handsome, he was brilliant, he could have been rich, he could have been famous, he could have gotten married, or at least he could have had a lot of girlfriends, whatever. He never cared. He didn't care about any of this stuff. This is because he's a very Ketu-dominant person. Ascended in Ashwini, in Aries, Ketu conjunct Mars, conjunct Moon, in Virgo in his 6th house, the house of work. And he actually gave this quote that was something like, there's no greater satisfaction than to, I think, like, to create something, or I don't know, obviously I'm butchering the quote, like something like, there's no greater satisfaction than to see your creation come to life, or something like that. So he was truly disinterested. I should have taken the time to look at his Navamsha, but I haven't. I didn't have the time. But I'm really interested to see his Navamsha and his D10 chart, because the Ketu themes are probably continuing there. Another example I also mentioned with regards to physical appearance. Oh, I did mention this. Did I mention Sean Connery? Sean Connery. The funny thing is, so these are examples of men or actors or famous people who were not necessarily creating Ketu-oriented art, but they themselves, as actors, portrayed characters that had a lot of Ketu energy. Sean Connery, for instance, had ascended in Mula in Sagittarius conjunct Saturn, also in Mula. So Mula, by the way, is one of the nakshatras that is ruled by Ketu. Also had Sun in Magha, which is also ruled by Ketu. So he's someone who really had a lot of Ketu energy. I haven't looked at the entirety of his chart, but just having ascendant in Ketu and also conjunct Saturn, can I just say that it matches him? Because for as long as I can remember, Sean Connery always looked like an elderly gentleman. Like he almost looked like he was 60 his entire life. Like at least when I watched him in movies, or over 40 at least. Okay, maybe I haven't watched some of his older movies, but yeah, Saturn. So he looked like the patriarch. He looked like a patriarch, but he also looked like a wise old man. You know, like he had that aura of wisdom about him, like, and of spiritual tendencies, if you know what I mean. Wisdom, I guess. There's no other way to call it. Another example, Lance Henriksen, Jupiter conjunct. Unfortunately, I think his time was unknown as well, but he has Jupiter conjunct Mercury conjunct Saturn in Ashwini Nakshatra, ruled by Ketu, and he was famous for a show called Millennium, where he was basically able to read minds. Like, I mean, again, very Ketu theme, very Ketu dominated theme. Morgan Freeman, Ketu conjunct Sun in Taurus in his third house of communication. Morgan Freeman has like one of the most calming voices ever. Like, and his Ruda Lagna is in Scorpio, and Mars is conjunct Rahu in his Aruda Lagna, while Ketu is conjunct Sun in the 7th from his Aruda Lagna. Remember, I mentioned this in the Aruda Lagna series, that planets in the 1st and 7th from the Aruda Lagna are basically planets that are visible to the rest of the world. So planets that define your image to the world. And in his case, he really played a lot of these wise old men kind of roles. I mean, again, Morgan Freeman, much like Sean Connery, is one of those actors that, like, he seemed to be old since forever, and he has always played like these older, like, wise characters who have the answers. And he even played God, funny enough, in Bruce Almighty. So, I mean, definitely a very Ketu kind of energy that he gives off. Right. Another example. And let me think. Marina Diamandis. Did I mention her? She is I don't know how many people know her, but she is a popular singer in, I would say, the European zone. She also goes by the name of Marina, or Marina and the Diamonds. And she also, the reason I mention her is because, to me, she's also very spiritual. So she has a really quirky kind of style and a quirky way of expressing herself, but also physically, she's extremely pale. And you can easily see her. Maybe I'm going to look for some photos and put them on the video. She's extremely pale, and she just has this kind of weird sense of music. She seems to, like, she has been singing for a long time. She doesn't have like super mainstream success, and yet she still has a very solid fan base that are loyal to her. And her music is really good, I think. Steve Jobs, Ketu conjunct Jupiter in the 11th house, aspecting Sun in Aquarius by 9th aspect. And the Sun also happens to be his Lagna Lord. And he also had Mars in Ashwini, a very Ketu dominant person again. A person who would not compromise on his vision. Oh, and I left the greats for last. David Lynch. I mean, to me, David Lynch and Stephen King, who is, to me, the king of Ketu. But let me start with David Lynch. So David Lynch obviously directed Twin Peaks, which is, again, one of the most possibly Ketuvian works of art that I have ever seen. I mean, and it starts with a murder. Like, everything. And then he also made Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet. All of these things are kind of creepy. There's, like, things like, like time warping and different dimensions and demons and really dark, creepy themes. I mean, if you've seen Twin Peaks, I don't know, like, it's really creepy. I mean, it's really dark. And yeah, it's funny because it's also like incredibly weird. So I don't know. I can't even make up my mind if I like it or not, to be honest. But I will say that it is very original. I will say that. So David Lynch to me is definitely another creative genius, I think, because he always stayed true to his vision. And he has Moon in Magha Nakshatra, again ruled by Ketu, aspected by Ketu's 9th aspect. Also has Ketu in the 3rd house conjunct Mercury. What do you know? In Sagittarius. So his communication is happening through a Ketuvian energy. He talks about, and he illustrates Ketu-dominant imagery and stories. So really, I mean, David Lynch is just classic. He's a classic example. And Stephen King, I mean, to me, Stephen King is like the king of Ketu. He's the king of Ketu. He is like the most Ketuvian dominant person, and I happen to like all of his stuff. And like literally some of my favorite all-time favorite movies, which are some of my all-time favorite movies, which are The Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me, are based on novellas written by Stephen King. And both of them coincidentally start with a murder. Like, hello, Ketu and murder. There's just like, there's an indestructible link between Ketu and death and creepy stuff in general. Ketu in his chart so he has Ketu conjunct Jupiter conjunct Moon in Scorpio in his 5th house. Could he be even more of an obvious example? Like, dear God, I haven't looked at his Navamsha and D10, but I'm pretty sure that this Ketu theme, it only gets deeper. But Ketu conjunct Jupiter conjunct Moon in the 5th already just shows that his Ketu energy will show through the 5th house, which is the house of creativity. And Jupiter rules publishing and writing. And actually, Moon conjunct Jupiter is one of those aspects that I've heard is likely to create a good writer or a prolific writer, a writer that writes a lot of stuff. I think Jules Verne also had Moon conjunct Jupiter, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, Stephen King, he put out like novel after novel, story after story, each one of them creepier than the one before, and they all revolve around demons, death, spirits, other dimensions, other dimensional creatures, themes of outsiders, themes of fear. I mean, for instance, I wanted to focus on 2 examples, and also, before I get to the examples, to help his overall writing career, he also had Sun conjunct Venus conjunct Mercury in Virgo in his 3rd house, unrelated to Ketu, but he also had that going for him. And Moon, his Lagna Lord, like I mentioned, is conjunct Ketu, so very Ketu dominant. And then on top of that, he also has this conjunction in Scorpio, where Ketu is very strong because it's in its own side, and the Moon is weak, which kind of shows that, well, his Moon is kind of focused on creepy stuff. And just 2 of the stories that I want to focus on, It and Stand By Me is a movie that was made based on a novella called The Body, that he wrote. And the reason I wanted to focus on these 2 movies, let's say, that are based on his writings, is that you see a theme here that, first of all, there is a theme, yes, of a creepy. So there is a creepy theme, right? In The Body, there's nothing supernatural. It's about 4 friends that meet to find the body of a disappeared boy in their town, whatever, and they hope to become. Oh, and the funny thing is, I haven't thought about this until now, they want to find the body to become famous. They want to show up in the paper. So it starts out with this was happening at some point in the 1950s or the 60s, and these kids are like somewhere between 10 and 12, I would estimate. And they want to find this body to make it to the paper, which is a very Rahu theme. So their main motivation to find the body is a Rahu theme. Anyway, and in It, there's a group of friends that all of them are being tortured by this intergalactic whatever entity, whatever the hell it is, called It, and that only they see. And so so there's in both of these movies, there's a theme of a group of friends that are outcasts one way or another. In Stand By Me, each of these kids are portrayed as somehow marginalized by the society that they live in. One of them is marginalized because, let me remember. I think, yeah, one of them is marginalized because he comes from a troublemaker family. So he's connected. Everybody thinks that he's going to be no good, just like his family. And he gets scapegoated a lot for stuff that he didn't do. This is the character that River Phoenix portrayed, if you've seen the movie. Then there's another character that had an abusive father that he had mixed feelings about. And people just made fun of him because his father was insane, but his father was a war veteran and basically had gone crazy, probably had PTSD, and burned this kid's ear off. And everybody was picking on him because his father was locked up in a lunatic asylum. Then there was the other kid whose older brother had died. There's a theme of death here, a theme of loss. Whose older brother had died, I think, a summer before this. And as he said in the movie, he feels invisible in his family because the older brother was clearly favored over him, and he was not particularly well seen by his parents. And on top of that, he also had to deal with his parents just taking out their frustration and their pain on him, or rather just ignoring him, and he literally feels invisible. There is a line in the movie where he says, "I had become the invisible boy," because his parents don't even see him anymore. And you kind of see them in the movie almost like ghosts, they're walking around absent from the world around them because they're still in trauma from the death of his brother. And then there's the fourth kid, who is the overweight kid, and he gets marginalized because of that. So in one way or another, each of these kids kind of like an outcast. They're not popular, whatever, and although it's not explained in the movie, it's probably the reason why they want to become famous and they go for this body. And anyway, so it's really kind of a spiritual thing. The whole story of the film, or like the story of the novella, is like they go, for this, to find this kid, and then they along the way confront their various insecurities and their pains and kind of become united together. They become, their friendship becomes stronger, at least for the time being. And then in It, you have a story of these kids who, again, I don't remember exactly how each of them, but each of them also have a story. They feel kind of outcast. They call themselves the Loser Club, and they're each targeted by these things. So they become united by the suffering that each of them sees this creature called It. So they form this really strong friendship based on basically facing this horror together. And basically both of these stories are like friendship and all this stuff, but what I was really interested in is this theme of them being outcasts, which is typical for Ketu, and then on top of that, dealing with these creepy subjects, which obviously is also very Ketu. And yes, so I mean, this is and obviously Stephen King had a lot of stuff. He had The Outsider, he had The Mist, let me think, The Dreamcatcher, like all of these stories I think were about like aliens and other dimensions and demons and whatnot. So a lot of creatures that are basically not from our reality. And it's really easy to see where they all came from, because he probably has an extremely rich imagination when it comes to pretty dark subject matters. Obviously a very fertile mind, basically. Right. And this has been it, pretty much. Like, this is what I wanted to say, and again, it's really kind of dragged on, but this is what I wanted to say, and I hope you have enjoyed it, even though it hasn't been the most organized video ever. But if you have made it to the end, thank you once again, and if you liked it, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell, And please comment in the comment sections whether you liked it, hated, whatever, like what you would want to add. Do you agree with the examples? Maybe other examples you want to add, etc., etc. Anything you want to comment, please comment in the comment section. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, please check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. Thank you.